The scent of brewing coffee and rain-soaked earth was the scent of Carol Peterson's life. At 68, her world in Columbus, Ohio, was a tapestry woven from comfortable, predictable threads. The house, a modest two-story colonial they'd bought when their son David was just a boy, hummed with a quiet history. The floral print armchair in the living room was molded perfectly to her shape, a perch from which she had watched decades of seasons change through the large picture window. On the mantelpiece, a curated history of their life stood in silver frames. Their wedding photo from 1978, Frank beaming in his slightly too tight tuxedo, David's gap-toothed school pictures, a proud snapshot of Frank standing beside his gleaming Kenworth truck, the machine that was both his livelihood and his longest rival for her time. Waiting was the one constant in her 45-year marriage. As a long-haul truck driver, Frank's life was the open road, a series of distant highways and lonely truck stops. Hers was the anchor, the warm port he always returned to. His trips, sometimes lasting 2 or 3 weeks, were punctuated by loving, crackly phone calls and postcards from places like Phoenix or Sacramento, his familiar scrawl a comforting presence in her mailbox. When he came home, the house would fill with his booming laugh and the comforting weight of his presence. He'd bring her small, thoughtful gifts, a piece of turquoise from Arizona, a saltwater taffy from a California pier, a silly snow globe from a truck stop in Reno. Their love was a settled, sturdy thing, weathered by time and distance into a shape she trusted completely. Just last night, he'd called from a rest stop. "Should be in Denver by morning, hun," he'd said, his voice tired but warm. "The Rockies are something else at sunrise. Wish you were here to see it." She'd smiled, picturing it. "Just drive safe, Frank. The mountains can wait." She was just settling into her armchair, a half-finished baby blanket of soft yellow yarn on her lap for a neighbor's grandchild, when the phone rang. The caller ID was an unfamiliar 915 area code. A telemarketer, she assumed, letting it ring once, twice, the shrill sound an unwelcome intrusion on her quiet afternoon. But a strange prickle of unease, a cold finger tracing her spine, made her pick it up on the third ring. "Hello?" she said, her voice mild. A woman's voice, professional and disconcertingly calm, responded. "Am I speaking with Mrs. Carol Peterson?" The formality was jarring. "Yes, this is she." There was a slight pause on the other end, the kind that precedes bad news, a pocket of silence where the world holds its breath. "Ma'am, my name is Sarah Jenkins. I'm a patient liaison at Del Sol Medical Center in El Paso, Texas. I'm calling about your husband, Frank Peterson." Carol's heart gave a violent lurch, the knitting needles clattering to the hardwood floor. El Paso? Her mind scrambled to make sense of it. El Paso? No, there must be a mistake. "My husband is in Colorado. He's on his way to Denver." "I'm sorry, ma'am," the voice said, patient and unwavering. "He was admitted here." The words hit her like stones. "Is he all right?" "Has there been an accident?" she asked, her voice suddenly thin, the room beginning to feel airless. "Ma'am," the liaison said, her tone softening with practiced sympathy. "Mr. Peterson was admitted to our intensive care unit this morning. He suffered a massive heart attack." The room began to tilt, the floral pattern of the wallpaper swimming before her eyes. Carol gripped the receiver, her knuckles white. "A heart attack? Is he awake?" The silence on the other end stretched into an eternity. "Mrs. Peterson," the woman said gently, "your husband is in a coma. The doctors are doing everything they can, but they advised that you should get here as soon as possible." The carefully woven tapestry of her life had just been ripped from the loom, leaving nothing but frayed, meaningless threads. The flight to Texas was a 4-hour eternity in a pressurized tube, surrounded by the banal chatter of strangers. Carol sat numbly by a window, the patchwork of heartland farms below giving way to the vast, rust-colored expanse of the Southwest. Her mind, a frantic engine, replayed Frank's last call over and over. The Rockies are something else at sunrise. Had he been lying then? Why would he lie about something so trivial? She had called David in a daze, her own voice sounding foreign and brittle as she relayed the news. His shocked silence, followed by a torrent of questions she couldn't answer, was a fragile anchor in her storm of disbelief. He was booking his own flight from Chicago, promising to be there by morning. But for now, she was alone, suspended between the life she knew and a terrifying, unknown reality. The taxi ride from the El Paso airport was a journey into a foreign country. The blistering heat hit her the moment she stepped outside, a physical assault so different from the gentle Ohio autumn she'd left behind. The landscape was alien. Sand-colored buildings, stark, rugged mountains crouched on the horizon, and signs in Spanish that further cemented her status as an outsider. At the Del Sol Medical Center, the automatic doors hissed open to a world of hushed voices and the pervasive smell of disinfectant. She clutched her purse, her heart hammering against her ribs as she followed the signs for the ICU. Each step on the polished linoleum was a prayer. Let him be okay. Let him wake up. Let this be a mistake. A nurse at the station, her face a mask of professional sympathy, pointed her toward room 304. He's stable for now, but he's not responsive. Carol nodded, unable to speak. Her hand trembled as she pushed open the heavy door. The room was dim, dominated by the rhythmic beeping and whirring of machines that were keeping her husband alive. And there, in the center of it all, was Frank. He looked smaller, older, and more fragile than she had ever seen him. A web of tubes and wires tethering him to the sterile present. A wave of pure, unadulterated grief washed over her, so powerful it buckled her knees. But it wasn't just the sight of her broken husband that made the air leave her lungs in a silent gasp. It was the woman sitting by his bed. She was about Carol's age, with dark, kind eyes that were red-rimmed from crying, and a rosary clutched tightly in her hand. She was holding Frank's left hand, stroking the back of it with a tenderness that spoke of long, deep intimacy. Carol's mind raced to find a category for this person. A colleague? A friend from the road he'd never mentioned? The woman looked up, her expression shifting from sorrow to mild confusion. Just then, a nurse bustled into the room to check a monitor. "Can I help you, ma'am?" the nurse asked, looking at Carol, who still stood frozen in the doorway. The world seemed to slow down. Carol found her voice, a reedy, uncertain sound. I'm his wife. I'm Carol Peterson." The words, which she had spoken with absolute certainty for 45 years, now felt like a question. The woman in the chair looked up, her brow furrowed in utter, heartbreaking bewilderment. She slowly let go of Frank's hand and stood, her gaze moving from Carol to the nurse and back again, as if trying to solve an impossible equation. Then, in a voice thick with a soft accent and stunned disbelief, she said the three words that shattered Carol's world into a million irreparable pieces. "No, I'm his wife." The space outside room 304 became a vacuum of disbelief. The nurse, a young woman named Chloe, stared from Carol to the other woman, her professional composure fracturing. I don't understand," she stammered, looking at the patient chart clipped to the door. "It lists a Maria Sanchez as the emergency contact and wife." Maria Sanchez. The name meant nothing to Carol. The woman, Maria, spoke, her voice trembling. "I am Maria Sanchez. Frank is my husband." She turned to Carol, her dark eyes filled not with malice, but with a profound shared confusion. "Who are you?" Before Carol could answer, the door to the waiting room burst open, and two people, a man and a woman in their late 30s, rushed toward them, their faces etched with panic. "Mama, what's happened?" "We came as soon as we heard," the young man said, embracing Maria. He looked over his mother's shoulder at Carol with a suspicious glare. "Who is this?" The young woman, her eyes a softer version of Maria's, asked, "Is Dad?" It was the word Dad that made Carol's blood run cold. She looked at the young man's face, the strong jaw, the shape of the eyes. It was Frank's, a younger, darker-haired version of her Frank. A hospital supervisor, a stern woman with a kind face, gently escorted them all to a private family waiting room, a small beige box designed for moments of intense crisis. There, under the hum of fluorescent lights, the impossible truth began to unspool. It was not a conversation. It was an autopsy of a life. "He and I were married in Columbus, Ohio on June 12, 1978, Carol stated, her voice shaking as she clutched her purse like a life raft. She could feel the stares of Maria's children, Rick and Elena, burning into her, Maria's face went pale. "We were married in a small church here in El Paso, on May 3rd, 1981. Every truth Carol offered was met with a devastating counter-truth from Maria. The long trucking routes to the West Coast that kept Frank away for weeks at a time, those were the weeks he was at home in El Paso, a devoted husband and father." Rick pulled out his phone, his hands shaking with anger, and swiped to a photo. It showed a smiling Frank, arm in arm with Maria, standing beside a birthday cake. "This was my 40th birthday 2 years ago," Rick said, his voice thick with accusation. "He was with us for a week." Carol's mind flashed back. That was the week of Frank's emergency run to San Diego, the one that earned him a hefty bonus. "The annual union conferences in Las Vegas?" Elena spoke up, her voice cracking. "Those were their anniversary trips. They went to Santa Fe every May." The fishing trip with buddies in Colorado a decade ago, from which he'd returned with a trophy trout and stories of the one that got away, that was the week he was by Elena's side for the birth of his first grandchild, a little girl named Sophia. Carol felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Her memories, the very bedrock of her identity, were being systematically dismantled. Frank hadn't just had an affair. He had built an entire parallel existence, complete with a home, a family, and 40 years of holidays, birthdays, and quiet moments. She looked at Maria, not as a rival, but as a fellow victim staring into the same abyss. The man in the hospital bed wasn't just a husband. He was an architect of a breathtakingly cruel and intricate deception. Carol's phone call to David was the hardest she had ever made. She sat in a deserted corner of the hospital cafeteria, the cheerful murals on the walls a cruel mockery of her reality. "David," she began, her voice a raw whisper, "you need to sit down." She explained the situation in fractured sentences, the words tasting like poison. On the other end of the line, David's initial concern for his father's health curdled into stunned silence, then into a white-hot rage that vibrated through the phone. "Another wife? A family? Mom, that's impossible." But as she continued, laying out the timeline, the photos, the undeniable truth, his disbelief morphed into a protective fury she hadn't heard since he was a teenager. "I'm on my way," he'd said, his voice cold and hard. "Don't you say another word to them until I get there." His arrival the next morning was like a thunderclap in the oppressive quiet of the ICU waiting area. He strode in, his face a mask of grief and fury, bypassing the nurse's station and heading straight for his mother. He wrapped her in a fierce hug, his large frame a shield against the world. "Mom, are you okay? What the hell is going on?" His gaze then fell upon Maria, Rick, and Elena, who were huddled together a few feet away, their own vigil a mirror of his. The confusion on David's face hardened into cold comprehension. "Are these—" he started, unable to finish the sentence. Carol could only nod, a fresh wave of shame washing over her for a betrayal that was not hers. Rick and Elena stood up, their expressions a mixture of defensiveness and their own brand of sorrow. They were grieving the loss of their father, the pillar of their family. David was grieving the loss of the man he thought his father was, and his anger was sharp and immediate. 40 years, David said, his voice low and dangerous, directed at no one and everyone. "He lived a whole other life for 40 years, and you never suspected a thing?" The question was aimed at his mother, but his eyes burned into Maria. Before Carol could respond, Elena stepped forward, her hands clenched. "Don't you talk to my mother that way," she said, her voice shaking. "We didn't know. He was our father. He was a good father. He was here for everything." David let out a short, bitter laugh that was more of a bark. "A good father? Good fathers don't abandon their real family to play house 1,000 miles away. Do you have any idea how many birthdays he missed? My high school graduation? He was stuck in a snowstorm in Wyoming." "I guess that's what he called your family." Rick put a protective arm in front of his sister. "He wasn't playing house. This was his home. We were his family. Maybe you're the ones who were the side trip he took for work." The words, born of a lifetime of believing a lie, struck Carol like a physical blow. The waiting room, already thick with tragedy, was now filled with the poison of accusation. These were not just strangers, they were siblings, linked by the blood of a man who had betrayed them all. and they were tearing each other apart over the scraps of a life that had never been whole. For 2 days, a fragile and volatile truce settled over the 4th floor of Del Sol Medical Center. The families operated in unspoken shifts, a morbid changing of the guard dictated by politeness and simmering hostility. When Carol and David were in the room, their quiet grief filling the space, Maria and her children would wait outside, their whispered Spanish a constant mournful murmur in the hallway. Then they would trade, and Carol would retreat to the waiting room, unable to listen to Maria's soft prayers to a man Carol felt she no longer knew. The air was thick with averted gazes, with the things left unsaid, with the rhythmic sigh of the ventilator that was the only sound they all had in common. Frank remained utterly still, a passive object at the center of the storm he had created. David spent hours scrolling through old photos on his phone, his face hardening with each image of a smiling, duplicitous Frank. Carol saw him staring at a photo of himself as a boy, sitting on Frank's shoulders at a 4th of July parade. The memory, once cherished, was now tainted, a scene from a life built on lies. On the 3rd afternoon, something changed. A doctor had just delivered a grim update, no change in brain activity, the prognosis worsening. And for some reason, both families had lingered in the room, drawn together by the gravity of the news. They stood in their separate camps on opposite sides of the bed, a silent tableau of fractured grief. Carol was staring at Frank's face, tracing the familiar lines with her eyes, trying to find the man she married beneath the stranger he had become, when his eyelids fluttered. A collective gasp went through the room. His eyes, hazy and unfocused, slowly opened. They weren't seeing, not really. They were pools of dull gray, clouded by the deep fog of his coma. But then, they moved. His gaze drifted slowly to his right, landing on Carol's face, then on David standing beside her. For a split second, there was a flicker of something, a soft, dull recognition, the vestige of a 45-year habit. Then his head turned with a monumental, agonizing effort to the left. His eyes found Maria, her face awash with tears, and then Rick and Elena standing protectively behind her. The fog in his eyes suddenly evaporated. It was replaced not by love, not by sorrow, not even by confusion. It was replaced by a flash of pure, undiluted animal terror. His pupils dilated, and his mouth fell slack, a silent O of utter horror. It was the look of a con man whose elaborate masks had been ripped away simultaneously. It was the look of a man whose 2 separate, carefully constructed worlds had just collided in a hospital room. He saw them. He saw them together. The panic in his eyes was his confession, more damning and absolute than any words could ever be. It was the last expression he would ever have. A moment later, his eyes rolled back into his head, the brief, terrible clarity gone. He had slipped back into the darkness, leaving behind a silence more profound and terrible than any sound. The silent, terrified confession in Frank's eyes shifted the atmosphere from one of grieving to one of grim reckoning. The illusion was shattered for everyone, the last shred of doubt incinerated. With the doctors offering no hope for a meaningful recovery, the hospital's bureaucracy began its gentle, inexorable intrusion. A social worker named Mrs. Gable, a kind but firm woman in her 50s, met with them in the small, beige family room. Her folder was full of questions that would peel back yet another layer of Frank's deceit. "We need to discuss who holds the power of attorney for medical decisions," she began, her gaze moving between Carol and Maria with practiced neutrality. "I do," Carol said automatically, her voice flat. "We had our wills and directives drawn up years ago by our lawyer in Columbus. It's in our safe deposit box." Maria shook her head slowly, her expression weary. "No, I have it. Frank and I signed the papers with our lawyer here in El Paso 5 years ago, after he had that first heart scare on the road." She didn't know, Carol realized with a jolt, that his heart scare had happened in their kitchen in Ohio. Mrs. Gable's professional smile faltered as the 2 women described their seemingly valid, legally binding documents. The situation spiraled from there into a nightmare of paperwork and phone calls. It was David, channeling his rage into furious efficiency, who made the call to the Teamsters Union Benefits Office. He put the phone on speaker, and the 2 families listened in stunned silence as a cheerful administrator, explained Frank's benefits. He had two separate life insurance policies. The first, a modest policy taken out in 1980, listed Carol Ann Peterson as the sole beneficiary. The second, a much larger policy established in 1995, named Maria Elena Sanchez, Ricardo Sanchez, and Elena Sanchez as beneficiaries. The financial betrayal cut deeper, in a way, than the emotional one. It was colder, more calculated. This wasn't a man torn between two loves. It was a man meticulously managing two separate portfolios of life. The final blow came when Rick, sent home to find his mother's legal papers, returned with a thick file. Inside was the deed to their 4-bedroom home in a pleasant El Paso suburb. Frank Peterson was listed as the co-owner, and a bank statement showed a 30-year mortgage, with automatic payments being drafted from a Bank of America account Carol had never heard of. An account that, they soon discovered, Frank had been funding for decades. The man who had feigned concern over rising property taxes in Ohio, the man with whom she had carefully clipped coupons and managed a modest budget, had been simultaneously financing a second, more prosperous life. He had been building equity, assets, and a future with another family, all while performing the role of a simple, hard-working trucker for her. The man who was her partner had been running a second secret corporation of a life, and both women had been its unwitting, unpaid employees. The sheer, staggering weight of the legal and financial chaos pressed down on everyone, exhausting the anger and leaving a hollow ache in its place. The fight drained out of David, replaced by a weary, grim determination to protect his mother. Rick and Elena, faced with the terrifying possibility that the home they grew up in was built on a foundation of fraud, grew quiet and somber. The enemy was no longer the other family. It was the ghost of their father and the tangled web he had woven. The shift happened, unexpectedly, in the hospital cafeteria. It was late, and the room was mostly empty. Carol sat stirring a cup of tea she didn't want, when Maria sat down at the same small table. For a long moment they didn't speak. Two women marooned on the same desolate island of betrayal, the silence broken only by the hum of the vending machines. It was Carol who spoke first, her voice a near whisper. The year David graduated, Frank said he had to take an extra route to California to pay for tuition. He was gone for a month. He brought me back a piece of redwood burl, said he'd polished it himself at night in his truck. Maria looked up, her eyes filled with a familiar, deep pain. She reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet, extracting a worn photograph. It was of Frank, a younger Maria, and a teenage Elena, all beaming in front of the Eiffel Tower. "He took us to Paris that summer," she whispered. "He won the money in a workplace lottery. It was the most magical month of my life." In that shared, specific lie, the California trip that was actually Paris, a fragile, bitter bridge formed across the chasm of their anger. They weren't rivals. They were co-authors of a fiction they hadn't known they were writing. "The lawyers will have a field day with this," Carol said, the statement flat and devoid of emotion. "They will tear everything apart to get their fees. Him, us, everything." Maria nodded, her hands wrapped around her cold coffee cup. "They will take everything. What he built here, what he built with you. There will be nothing left for any of our children." For the first time, she said, "Our children," and the words encompassed David, Rick, and Elena, binding them in their shared, awful inheritance. They saw each other clearly then. Two women in their late 60s, on the precipice of a lonely and financially devastated old age, all because of one man's bottomless selfishness. Animosity was a luxury they could no longer afford. "We can't let that happen," Carol said, a new steely resolve in her voice. Maria met her gaze, and a silent, bitter agreement passed between them. They would not be Frank's final victims. "We need one lawyer," Maria said, her voice gaining strength. "Not one for you and one for me, one for the estate, to protect it from everyone else." It was not an alliance born of forgiveness or friendship, but of grim mutual survival. They would work together to untangle the mess their husband had left behind, if only to salvage what little they could from the wreckage for the children who were his only true legacy. Frank Peterson passed away 6 days after he first arrived at the hospital, slipping from his coma into death without ever facing the women he had wronged or the children whose lives he had fractured. Without ever facing the final steady tone of the heart monitor was not a sound of tragedy, but of release. The silence he left behind was a profound relief. In a sterile conference room, with a pragmatic lawyer they had jointly hired to represent the estate of Frank Peterson, the final decision was made. It was the only one that made any sense. Frank was cremated. His ashes were carefully divided into two identical, dignified bronze urns. One life, two endings. The following Saturday, Carol stood in a small chapel in Columbus, Ohio, clutching David's arm. The room was filled with friends who had known Frank as a devoted, if often absent, husband. They offered condolences for her loss, their faces etched with sympathy for a grief she couldn't fully feel. David stood at the lectern, his eulogy a masterclass in omission, speaking of his father's love for the open road, his reliable good nature, and his booming laugh. They remembered the Frank they knew, the man who sent postcards and always came home. They celebrated a life that was, in reality, only half a life, a carefully edited performance. 1,000 miles away, on that same day, Maria Sanchez stood in the crowded pews of Our Lady of Guadalupe Catholic Church in El Paso, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. The air was thick with incense and sorrow. Rick and Elena spoke in loving, tearful Spanish of the father who taught them to drive, who grilled burgers at every family barbecue, and who wept at their weddings. An entire community mourned a man who was a pillar of their lives, a good man named Frank. 2 funerals, 2 sets of memories, 2 communities grieving for 2 different men who happened to inhabit the same body. Months later, the legal battles were over. The alliance held. The assets, painstakingly untangled, had been divided as equitably as the law would allow. Carol was in her garden, her hands deep in the cool soil, when her phone rang. She recognized the El Paso area code. "Hello, Maria," she said. The conversation was brief and civil, 2 strangers checking in on the final logistics of their shared disaster. "The final check from the union policy cleared," Maria said. "Good," Carol replied. There was a pause. "I hope you are doing okay," Maria offered, the words hesitant. "I am," Carol said, and was surprised to find it was true. "You too, Maria." It wasn't friendship, but it was a quiet acknowledgement of their shared trauma and survival. When she hung up, Carol looked around the quiet house, the photos on the mantel now packed away in a box in the attic. The house no longer felt like a place of waiting. For the first time in 45 years, it was simply, entirely her own. She was free.